She wasn't born into power, she didn't wear silk at birth. There were no palace drums to announce her arrival, only the quiet breeze of Sichuan, and the whispers of fate. Her name was Yang Yuhuan, before she became legend, before poets sang of her face and emperors wept at her grave. She was just a girl with soft eyes and a presence so gentle. It made even silence pause. Yang Yuhuan was born in the year 719, in a modest but educated family. Her father served in the government, but they lived far from the glamorous capital, surrounded, not by marble and gold, but by bamboo and hills. Her early life was quiet, peaceful, ordinary, but Yang Yuhuan was anything but ordinary. Even as a child, people would stop and stare, not because she demanded attention, but because she carried something rare, a stillness, a glow, a beauty that didn't need words. She grew into a woman whose presence changed the temperature of a room. When she smiled, men forgot what they were saying. When she walked, it felt like time followed her. But it wasn't just her face, it was the way she spoke. Softly, carefully, like every word mattered. She played the pipa with delicate grace, and when she danced it was like poetry in motion. Every gesture held meaning. Every step, a secret dot in the tang court. Beauty was common. The emperor had hundreds of women to choose from. But Yang Yuhuan, she was unforgettable. She wasn't just looked at, she was felt at. It was this invisible pull, this strange and magnetic softness that would draw her into the heart of the empire, and eventually into the arms of the most powerful man in China. But her path was not straightforward. She was first married into the royal family not as a consort, but as the wife of Prince Shou, the emperor's own son. She became a princess, by title, but even then, rumors stirred. Not about scandal, but about beauty. Officials whispered of her elegance. Ladies envied her skin. Poets tried to capture her glow, with ink and failed. Behind palace curtains, eyes were watching her, and one of them was the emperor himself, Emperor Xuanzong, a ruler in his 50s. Once a fierce strategist and visionary, now found himself distracted, not by war, not by politics, but by a woman, his daughter-in-law. A forbidden desire was born, and from it, a story that would bring an empire to its knees. But in this chapter, we don't speak yet of tragedy. We speak of emergence, of a woman whose beauty would soon eclipse power, of a name that would echo through time not because of how she lived, but because of how deeply she was loved, and how dangerously Yang Yuhuan had risen, not with force, not with ambition, but with the most dangerous weapon of all, irresistible grace. Before there was chaos, there was glory. The Tang Dynasty, in the 8th century, stood like a golden mountain tall, unshaken and gleaming under heaven's favor. It was an empire at its peak. Its capital Chang'an was not just a city, it was the heart of the world, a living monument to order, art, and ambition. Merchants poured in from India, Persia, Arabia, bringing silk, jade, glass, and spices. Monks chanted sutras beside poets, composing verses that would last 1,000 years. In the markets, gold coins jingled, ink scrolls fluttered, and tongues from every continent echoed through the alleys. That this was not a nation hidden behind walls, it was a galaxy of cultures, beliefs, and ideas, orbiting one central sun, the emperor, and at that time, the emperor was Xuanzong. To his people, he was more than a ruler, he was the son of heaven. The man chosen to hold balance between earth and sky. But Xuanzong wasn't content with just peace, he wanted brilliance. He wanted his reign to be remembered as the greatest in Chinese history, and for a while it was. Under his rule, the arts flourished like spring blossoms. He built academies for painting, music, astronomy, and philosophy. He patronized Buddhist temples, but also supported Taoist scholars. He invited the best minds, the finest artisans, and the boldest visionaries to serve the empire, and they came hungry for the greatness he promised. The army was vast and modernized, borders were secure. The Silk Road buzzed with wealth and power. Xuanzong stood on top of a world that worshipped him. Aged but sharp, tired but still full of fire. In the grand palace, cloaked in red silk and gold. He planned for eternity. He had everything a ruler could ask for: power, legacy, and peace. But peace is delicate. And beneath the calm surface of this paradise, small cracks had already begun to form. There were whispers of corruption, of eunuchs gaining too much influence, of border generals growing restless. But Xuanzong didn't hear them, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He was searching for something else, not political, not strategic, something more human, more personal. He had ruled for decades, he had built an empire, but what he didn't have anymore was wonder. The spark that makes life worth living, the feeling that makes even an emperor feel alive again. And then she arrived, Yang Yuhuan. But that is the next chapter. For now, the empire gleams. The music of flutes fills the court. Scrolls are written in praise of the dynasty's eternal peace. And above it all, Emperor Xuanzong watches with pride, not knowing that what he's about to desire will cost him everything he built. The emperor had ruled for decades. He had seen war and peace, built palaces, commanded millions. But there was one thing he had never truly conquered. Desired at the age of 60, Emperor Xuanzong was no longer the fiery youth who had ascended the throne. His hair had silvered, his body slowed. But his mind, it still burned with dreams, with art, and with longing. In the endless halls of his palace, surrounded by concubines, ministers, poets, and generals, he was still alone. And then, one day, a sound stirred the air, a delicate melody from a pipa string. a voice like silk and perfume, a laugh that shimmered through the garden like falling petals. Yang Yuhuan, she was not unknown to him, not yet. In fact, she had entered the palace as the wife of one of his sons, Prince Shou. But fate, or perhaps the emperor's heart, had other plans. She was unlike any woman he had ever known, graceful but playful, gentle but clever. And her beauty, it was legendary, that her face was said to glow without paint, her skin like porcelain kissed by moonlight, her eyes, deep wells of mystery. Even seasoned eunuchs whispered, "She is not mortal. She must be from heaven." The emperor was captivated, not slowly, not cautiously, but with the wild hunger of a man who had forgotten what it meant to feel. And in his heart, obsession bloomed. He could not stop thinking of her, not in meetings, not in prayer, not even as his ministers begged for attention to matters of state. Eventually, tradition bent to his desire. To avoid shame, Yang Yuhuan became a nun for a brief time, just long enough to sever her marriage to the prince. Then she was summoned back, not as a wife, not as a concubine, but as Guifei, the highest of imperial consorts. The palace changed, where once there had been balance. Now there was gravity pulling everything toward her. The emperor smiled more, laughed more. He hosted banquets just to watch her dance. He composed poems for her, wrote songs. He gave her jade, gold, pearls, and land. And soon, her family, previously obscure, was elevated to powerful positions. Her cousin, young Guozhong, became a minister. Her relatives flooded the court. Power shifted, and the empire tilted. But Xuanzong was blind to it all. He saw only her. The way her sleeves moved like waves when she danced. The way her laughter echoed through the garden at dusk. The way she rested her hand on his, like they were the only two people in the world. In his mind, he ruled for her, and in her presence, the emperor once feared, once divine, became a man again. But love that burns too brightly always casts a shadow, and in that shadow, resentment grew. Among the generals, among the ministers, among the people, they whispered, "The emperor has forgotten his throne. He listens only to her. This will end in ruin." But he did not hear, because love had made him deaf. And so, the most powerful man in China became a servant to a single name, Yang Guifei. Behind every legend lies a human story. Yang Guifei to the world. She was a goddess wrapped in silk. To the emperor, she was the moon that lit his nights. But who was she? When the music stopped, when the silks were removed, when the eyes of the court turned away. Born Yang Yuhuan, she came from a modest but respectable family. Not royalty, not warriors, but scholars, people who knew how to read, to write, to please with charm rather than with swords. From a young age, she stood apart, not just for her beauty, though it was striking, but for her presence. She knew how to enter a room without a word and yet change the mood entirely. She knew how to smile in silence and make a king feel heard. She was graceful, but not passive. She was intelligent, but masked it in softness. In a world where women were expected to be quiet, obedient, shadows, young Guifei was a mirror. She reflected back to men their own desires, dreams, and insecurities. But behind that mirror was a woman of fierce instinct. She had survived the politics of the palace. She had watched wives be dismissed, concubines poisoned, sons exiled. She had been married once to Prince Shou, then hidden away in a Taoist convent, only to be summoned by the emperor himself. That journey was not accidental. It was survival, it was strategy, and perhaps it was destiny. Yet even as she rose to become Guifei, the emperor's favorite, she did not rule directly. Instead, she influenced. She never sat in the court chambers. She did not sign imperial decrees, but her whispers carried weight. She elevated her family. She softened the emperor's mood. And slowly, without ever shouting, she became the most powerful woman in China. But power in a palace is never without a price. Women envied her. Men feared her, scholars criticized her, and beyond the palace walls, the people began to murmur. Why does the emperor forget his duties? Why is her cousin promoted so quickly? What spell has she cast? To the court, she was a sorceress. To the poets, she was a muse. To the emperor, she was his soul. But to herself, she was a woman in a golden cage. She danced, not for joy, but because joy was expected. She smiled, even when her heart was heavy. She wore silk, even when it suffocated. And through it all, she loved. Yes, she loved. But even love, when tied to power, becomes a weapon others can use. Because one day, the empire would burn. And when it did, they would not blame the emperor. They would blame the woman behind the veil. Power never stays in one pair of hands, especially in a palace. Yang Guifei may have captured the emperor's heart, but it was her family who captured his empire. Once young Guifei became the favored consort, she asked for little, at least, outwardly. But behind closed doors, she whispered names, and one name rose higher than all the rest. Yang Guozhong, cousin. He was not a brilliant statesman. He wasn't loved by the people, but he had something more valuable, the trust of a woman who owned the emperor's soul. Soon, Yang Guozhong was appointed two key positions in government, first a minister, then chancellor. Then effectively, the second most powerful man in China. The court changed. Banners bearing the Yang family name were everywhere. Nephews, cousins, brothers in Luch was elevated, and anyone who dared question it silenced, banished, or worse. But the old aristocrats murmured, "This is not a dynasty, it's a family business." But no one could challenge them. The emperor, once a sharp ruler, grew increasingly passive. He stopped attending councils regularly. He stopped reviewing military reports. Instead, his time was spent with Yang Guifei listening to music, watching her dance, writing poetry in her honor, and while love bloomed in the inner palace. Unrest brewed outside it. Corruption grew. Officials took bribes openly. The border, generals complained of being underfunded. Taxes increased. The people suffered. And through it all, the Yang family prospered. They built mansions. They hosted lavish feasts. They lived as if the empire was theirs alone to enjoy. But history does not forget excess. The more the Yang clan rose, the more enemies they made. The whispers grew louder. They've poisoned the emperor's mind. They've stolen the treasury. They've abandoned the people. One voice became many. One complaint became a rebellion. But inside the palace, love still played its diluted song. The emperor believed he ruled. Yang Guifei believed she loved, and Yang Guozhong believed he would never fall. But what no one realized was this. Every empire has a tipping point, and every dynasty has a crack. A crack that begins not with war or famine, but with unchecked love and unearned power. And for the Tang Dynasty, that crack had a name, the Yang clan. Beyond the silken walls of the Imperial palace, far from the perfumed halls where Yang Guifei danced and the emperor dreamed, a different world stirred. The frontiers of the Tang Empire stretched wide, vast deserts, wild mountains, and distant tribes all watched with calculating eyes. Keeping them in check were the generals. Men hardened by war, not by poetry. Among them, one name began to echo with quiet power. An Lushan, a half-Sogdian, half-Turkic military commander. An Lushan was no aristocrat. He was charming and ambitious, and most importantly, he was favored by Yang Guifei. Some said she treated him like a son. Others whispered of something more. Regardless, her protection gave him access. An Lushan rose quickly through the ranks. He was given command of multiple provinces, a private army numbering hundreds of thousands. And while the court feasted, he drilled. While they wrote verses, he counted arrows. He watched. He watched as Yang Guozhong abused his power, as corruption drained the imperial treasury. As border defenses weakened, he saw what the emperor would not, and where others stayed silent, he began to plan. In the tea houses of the north, soldiers spoke in hushed voices. General An is the only one who still cares for the people. He will bring justice. Even the commoners began to believe the myth. But inside the palace, the whispers never reached the emperor. Xuanzong was drunk on love. He trusted Yang Guozhong. He saw An Lushan as loyal, a dangerous mistake. Yang Guozhong, sensing An Lushan's rising popularity, grew jealous. He accused him of plotting rebellion. He demanded the emperor recall him. But the emperor hesitated. To him, it was just court drama. He didn't see the wildfire beginning to burn in the north. An Lushan did, and as he left the palace bowing low, eyes downcast, he already knew. He would return, but not as a general. As a conqueror. Winter had barely begun when the skies over northern China turned gray, not from snow, but from smoke. It started in the shadows. Quiet, precise. Troops loyal to An Lushan station in Fanyang began to move. They were not peasants with pitchforks. They were trained warriors, disciplined, battle-hardened. And, on a cold December day in 755 AD, An Lushan declared the unthinkable. The emperor is blind. His ministers are corrupt. I, An Lushan, rise not against the throne, but against the poison surrounding it. It was rebellion wrapped in righteousness. He marched south. City after city fell quickly. Many opened their gates willingly, believing him to be a savior from Yang Guozhong's tyranny. Inside the imperial palace, panic began to crack the golden walls. Yang Guozhong, once untouchable, now scrambled to organize resistance. But the Tamps, armies were fractured, slow to respond. The court had grown soft-bloated with poetry, parades, and luxury. By the time they took An Lushan seriously, he had already captured Luoyang, the eastern capital of the Tang. There, he did the unthinkable. He declared himself emperor of a new dynasty. The great Yan, the throne, now had a rival. Xuanzong, shaken, enraged, tried to rally his empire. He called on distant generals, offered rewards, begged loyalty. But his voice no longer carried the strength it once did. And worse, the people no longer feared the Tang. As cities burned and generals switched sides, the emperor made a choice. Few rulers dare. He ran. The imperial court fled westward to the safety of Sichuan's mountains. Caravans of royalty, concubines, eunuchs, and soldiers stretched across the narrow roads. Among them, Yang Guifei, wrapped in silk, riding under heavy guard, still adored by the emperor, still hated by the soldiers. And in the chaos of this flight, something dark began to stir. The empire was crumbling, and the people wanted someone to blame, someone with soft hands, painted lips, and the emperor's heart. The summer of 756 was not kind. The imperial caravan crawled through the treacherous mountain paths of Sichuan, fleeing the advancing armies of An Lushan. The once mighty Tang court was now reduced to whispers and weariness. Their robes were stained with dust, their jewels dulled by grief. At the heart of the procession rode Emperor Xuanzong. His face, once radiant with power, was now pale, haunted by shame. Behind him, guarded closely, sat young Guifei. She still wore silk, still adorned herself in the scent of lotus, but her gaze, once soft and playful, was now fixed in silence. The soldiers escorting them were not palace guards. They were hardened men pulled from distant frontiers, and they resented her. Whispers grew louder with every mile. This is the woman who led us here. Her cousin stole the empire. She dances while our cities burn. One night, as the caravan reached the narrow pass of Maiwei Station, the tension broke. The soldiers refused to march forward. They surrounded the emperor's tent not with swords drawn, but with hearts full of rage. Their general stepped forward and spoke the words no emperor should ever hear. Your Majesty, we will protect you, but not her. The people demand justice. We demand her death. Xuanzong's world shattered. He pleaded. He begged. He offered titles, gold, amnesty. But the soldiers stood firm. And so, in that moment between love and survival, he chose the empire. He summoned young Guifei. She was silent. She bowed. And without protest, she walked toward her fate. No trial. No screams. Just a length of silk rope, wrapped around the neck of the most beautiful woman in China. Her body was buried hastily by the roadside. The woman who once made the emperor forget his empire had now died. And when dawn came, the caravan moved again. But something had changed. The emperor had lost more than a lover. He had lost his soul. The caravan marched on, but the silence was unbearable. Where once music and laughter echoed through the court, now came only the sound of hooves on dirt and the soft rustling of morning robes. The air hung heavy, not with the cries of grief, but with something deeper. Guilt, guilt. Emperor Xuanzong rode ahead, cloaked in imperial garments, but inside, he was hollowed out. He had survived the soldiers. He had escaped the rebellion. But he could not escape the image of young Guifei kneeling, accepting her fate, her beauty fading into dust. In the cold mountains of Sichuan, the once great emperor became a ghost of himself. He no longer issued decrees. He barely ate. At night, they say, he whispered her name into the wind, like a prayer that would never be answered. But the empire could not mourn forever. In the capital, Chang'an lay in ruins. An Lushan's rebels had taken the city. The sacred heart of the dynasty now beat in enemy hands. The Tang court, broken and displaced, began to regroup in exile. New generals emerged. Fierce loyalists rallied under the name of the emperor. The fire of vengeance began to burn again, but it came too late for Xuanzong. He had lost his will to rule. In a rare moment of lucidity, he abdicated the throne to his son, the crown prince, who would later become Emperor Xuanzong. The transfer of power was quiet, no grand ceremony. Just an old man handing over an empire he no longer had the strength to carry. And what of young Guifei's memory? Xuanzong never forgot. He commissioned artists to paint her portrait from memory. He had musicians play her favorite melodies. He ordered a poem written in her honor, one so sorrowful it would echo through centuries. She had become more than a lover. She became legend. But legends, like phoenixes, rise from ashes, and so began the transformation of Yang Guifei from a courtesan blamed for an empire's fall to a tragic symbol of doomed love, a woman immortalized not just for her beauty, but for the price she paid to love an emperor. The palace was never the same. Yang Guifei had not merely been a consort. She was the soul of the court. Her absence echoed in every corner of the imperial halls. The jasmine gardens she once walked in bloom now stood still. The silk curtains that once danced with her laughter hung heavy with dust. Those who had once envied her were quiet now. Those who once gossiped about her now remembered her gently. Without her presence, the palace felt like a shrine, silent, haunted, and sacred. Emperor Xuanzong, though no longer on the throne, remained in the inner court. Every day he visited the same pavilion where young Guifei once played the pipa. He kept a strand of her hair wrapped in embroidered silk, and he often murmured, "If I could trade the empire for her life, I would." But regrets could not rebuild a kingdom. The new Emperor Xuanzong was focused on restoring order. The Tang court, now hardened by betrayal and grief, moved forward without sentiment. Ministers who had once praised young Guifei now erased her name from official records. Her relatives were exiled or executed punishment for the perceived corruption she had brought to the empire. It was as if the court wanted to pretend she never existed, but memories are not so easily erased. In secret, handmaidens still lit incense in her memory. Poets still whispered her name in verse, and among the people, rumors spread not just of her beauty, but of her loyalty, of a woman who never sought power, but was swept into it, of a woman who died to save the man who loved her. Outside the palace, life resumed. The empire limped forward. The rebellion was quelled, but scars remained on the land, and in the hearts of those who remembered the golden days before the fall. But inside the emperor's heart, time stood still. He once ruled the greatest dynasty on earth. He once had the world at his feet. But now, all he wanted was one more evening, one more song, one more glimpse of the woman who once made an emperor forget his empire. As the dust of rebellion settled, a new narrative took shape, crafted not by truth, but by politics, pain, and poetry. Yang Guifei, once the adored consort, was now painted as a scapegoat. Historians, at court pressed by the new regime, penned her name with ink dipped in accusation. She had bewitched the emperor. She had corrupted the court. She had invited ruin with her family's ambition. This was the version that entered the DOS records. Clean, convenient, condemning. But outside the walls of bureaucracy, another version began to rise. Poets and commoners remembered Yang not as a villain, but as a tragic heroine caught in the machinery of empire, punished for a love too bold, too powerful, too consuming. Bards sang songs of her delicate beauty, of the emperor's obsession, and of the silent sacrifice she made for the sake of peace. In Dufu's verses, the rebellion became the wound, and her death its most painful cost. In by Juji's legendary poem, The Song of Everlasting Sorrow, she was immortalized not as a temptress, but as a symbol of eternal love. Lost to the cruelty of fate, the line blurred between memory and myth. Was she truly the cause of the empire's downfall, or had she been a victim of power, used and discarded? Some whispered that she had survived, that her execution was staged, that she lived in secret exile under another name. Others believed her spirit haunted the palace, still dressed in jade and silk, waiting for her beloved beneath the moon. But one truth remained. The Tang Dynasty never recovered, and neither did Emperor Xuanzong. In his final years, he was a man, haunted not by rebellion, nor by defeat, but by a love that outlived an empire. A love the world blamed for its fall, even as it wept for its memory. Young Guifei became more than a woman. She became legend, a name spoken with both reverence and regret, a beauty so powerful, it nearly broke a dynasty, and yet somehow, it still lived on. Centuries passed, but the name Young Guifei never faded. Where emperors crumbled into dust, and dynasties turned to ash, her legend only grew etched, not in marble, but in memory, in music, in verse. At the Mawei Courier Station, where she is said to have drawn her last breath, a modest shrine was raised. Pilgrims came not just to mourn but to wonder. Did she truly die here? Was her love real? Could any woman be so beautiful, so destructive, so tragic? Artists painted her with rose-petal skin and eyes like dew. Playwrights wrote of her silk robes trailing behind her like smoke in the wind. Her story was retold in whispers and wails, across brothels and banquet halls, temples and tea-houses. But her legacy wasn't just in art, it was in how people began to understand love, power, and sacrifice. For scholars, she became a cautionary tale proof that unchecked emotion could topple empires. For lovers, she became a martyr proof that even the deepest love can be punished by the world. And for women, she was both a warning and a mirror, because Yang Guifei was not the first woman to be blamed for a man's downfall, nor would she be the last. The idea of the femme fatale, of a woman so enchanting she becomes dangerous, was carved into cultural memory. Yet behind the myth, behind the poetry and blame, there lived a real woman, one who danced when commanded, loved when forbidden, and died when silence was demanded. Even now, scholars debate her role. Was she a manipulator or manipulated? Was her love selfish or selfless? But perhaps the truth lies, not in choosing sides but in accepting that in every powerful woman's story, the world will always find it easier to blame her than to understand her. Yang Guifei's tomb may be quiet, but her legend still sings. After her death at Meiwei, the world moved on. The rebellion raged. The empire bled. And Emperor Xuanzong, once the most powerful man in the world, was now a ghost of himself. But ghosts were all he had left. He had sacrificed the woman he loved to save a throne he could barely keep, and though his ministers praised him for choosing duty, the emperor's soul remained buried not in Chang'an's palace, but at the lonely station where young Guifei died. He returned to the capital, a broken man. His hair turned white within months. He rarely spoke, rarely ruled. The great emperor, who once hosted grand feasts beneath lantern-lit pavilions, now wandered the palace gardens alone, whispering her name to the wind. There are stories, quiet, sorrowful ones, of how he would wake at night, hearing the echo of her laughter in the halls, of how he banned her favorite music, unable to bear the pain it stirred, and of how he sent emissaries across the empire, searching for any trace that she had somehow survived, that the execution was a lie. But no proof came. In his final years, Xuanzong abdicated the throne and became a recluse monk in all but name. He lived in the shadows of temples and misty pavilions, not praying for salvation but for a reunion in the next life. He commissioned poets to immortalize her, ordered painters to recreate her face from memory, and from his grief, the most famous love poem in Chinese history was born, the Song of Everlasting Sorrow, a lament so beautiful it made readers weep. A tale of love so deep, even death could not sever it. He had lost an empress, a nation, but above all, he had lost the only woman who made him forget he was emperor and, remember, he was human. That was her power, and that was his punishment. In the end, it wasn't the empire that broke Xuanzong, it was the memory of the one woman he could never bring back. Long after Emperor Xuanzong faded into history, Yang Guifei's story lived on. The famous poem, the Song of Everlasting Sorrow, immortalized her love and tragic death, echoing through generations. Artists painted her face. Playwrights wrote of her charm. Even emperors centuries later whispered her name. In China, she became more than a woman. She became a symbol of beauty, of passion, and of how love, when mixed with power, can bring down empires. Yang Guifei wasn't a general. She never led armies, but her presence shifted the fate of the Tang Dynasty. Her beauty enchanted an emperor. Her family's greed weakened the court. Her death marked the end of an age. History remembers her not just for her looks, but for the storm she left behind. Because sometimes, it only takes one woman to make the world forget reason and remember desire.